Okay, good morning, everyone. Again, by way of introduction, I'm Ellen Laramie with American Cargo Service. I'm trying to figure out how to make my slideshow continue. Hold on just a second. There we are. Okay. Um, we have a customs power of attorney for the University of California, which means that we can arrange customs clearance for shipments imported by the University of California at any campus. And we've been doing this quite some time, so we have the experience to clear the wide variety of things that the university imports. I know there's, plant and animal products, chemicals, live animals, biological samples, scientific instruments, etc. And we can also arrange transportation. If you have an import that requires you to arrange the transportation, we can do that for you by whether it needs to be by air, ocean, or ground. What I'm hoping to talk about today, is the basics of how an import clearance works, and some of the current tariffs. It's a little bit hard to keep up with all the changes recently with tariffs, but I'm just going to cover some of the more common ones that you're going to see. Um, Something else that's come up recently is the end of the de minimis, excuse me, the end of de minimis. And this means that low value shipments that used to be able to come into the country duty free are no longer duty free and actually require a customs clearance process. So a lot of your lower value imports, so you're going to start seeing a requirement for customs clearance and starting to see tariff charges on those. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the duty-free options, so how you can get some of your items into the country duty-free, or at least apply to do so. Um, so whenever a shipment arrives in the US from a foreign country, customs clearance is required. The low value shipments used to be able to come in just with a manifest clearance from a carrier like FedEx or UPS. That's no longer allowed uh, with the end of de minimis. The importer of record is required to supply a bond for shipments valued over $2,500, which this bond allows for the shipment to be released, and it gives customs additional time to review the entry. And if they find something about it, maybe they think the item wasn't classified correctly or something like that. It gives them a chance to review the entry and possibly come back and say that more duty is payable. Sometimes a shipment carrier like FedEx or UPS will clear a shipment under their own bond, and then they simply collect the duty and tax from the consignee at the time of delivery. FedEx will send you a bill. UPS will sometimes try to COD the duty charges. And duty and tariffs are based on the HTS code for the commodity being imported. I'll cover HTS codes a little bit in the next slide. And based on also now on the country of origin, where the item was manufactured, not necessarily where it was shipped from. So if you're buying something that maybe it shipped out of Canada, but it was made in China, you're going to be paying the tariff based on China. Additional tariffs are starting to be applied for certain commodities based on the content, like things that contain aluminum, steel, or copper. And they're talking also about adding a tariff for wooden products. So in addition to US Customs, there are other government agencies known as PGAs, or partner government agencies, that regulate imports. FDA regulates things like food, drugs, medical devices, and anything that emits like a radiation, like a laser. USDA covers plant and animals. CDC, and if you're importing a biological agent or potentially infectious substance, CDC permits may be required. Fish and wildlife, if you're bringing in any kind of wildlife, or even seashells. And then EPA covers things like chemicals and pesticides. Sometimes you'll see us ask you for a TSCA form, a TSCA, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act, and that's an EPA regulation. Basically, any chemical that you're bringing in you have to certify that it's complies with US regulations. Okay, this is a slide kind of describing how the harmonized tariff schedule works. The first six digits of a harmonized tariff number, it's a 10-digit number. The first six digits are pretty much harmonized throughout the world. In this example here, chapter 9, it covers coffee and tea. And then you go two more digits, 0901 covers coffee. And then you add two more digits for the subheading. So 0901.21 is roasted coffee. It narrows it down a little bit more. And then the last four digits vary by country. Different countries want to have different statistics, and they define different characteristics of the product. So in this particular example, they narrow it down a little bit further in the US. Okay, this is coffee, it's roasted, it's not decaffeinated, and it's organic. So there's a couple of different, additional breakdowns in those last four digits. But basically, you can expect the first six digits to be harmonized, or pretty much the same the worldwide. And so if your vendor sends you a harmonized tariff schedule with a different last four digits, it's usually not a problem. We just have to look at the US tariff and figure out which one applies to your product. Currently, these are some of the highlights of tariffs that are applicable by country. The United Kingdom, there is a 10% tariff, and this includes the applicable duty for the commodity. So if a commodity that was previously dutiable at 12% is now 10%, but if the previous duty was 3%, it brings it up to 10. The same situation with the European Union, except that it's 15%. They recently have a trade deal with Japan where there is a 15% tariff on things from Japan. And they did this sometime toward the end of August, and it was actually retroactive to August 1st. So things that came in that time period between when the tariff was announced and August 1st, additional bills could be sent by U.S. Customs. Right now, Brazil, they're talking about an additional 40% on top of the regular duty for the product. India, they've applied a 25% tariff because of India's purchase of Russian oil. And they also have a fentanyl tariff. It's not, obviously, we're not intentionally importing fentanyl, but this is a tariff intended to try to increase enforcement of fentanyl regulations. And this tariff applies to China, Canada, and Mexico. There are some exceptions for Canada and Mexico for products that are covered by NAFTA or USMCA. Right now, some of the major tariffs that are applicable by commodity are steel and aluminum. There are a list of harmonized tariff codes that are considered derivatives with steel or aluminum. And for those products, we need to know the percentage of the value of steel or aluminum of the product and the origin of the steel or aluminum. If you don't have documentation to show where the steel or aluminum component came from, they will apply a 200% tariff to the steel or aluminum because that is the highest rate, the rate that applies to Russian steel. So if you're buying anything that's mainly composed of steel or aluminum, you're going to need to find out from that vendor, where that steel came from and get some documentation to support that. The recent announcements, they've announced automobiles and auto parts, copper and copper derivatives, added onto that steel and aluminum list, and also heavy trucks. And more recently, they've talked about adding a tariff for wood products. This is a slide from a UC OP level slide for just describing the steel and aluminum derivatives. So there is a list of HCS codes provided by the White House order that says these items are considered to be derivatives of steel or aluminum. You need mill certificates when you're importing these things, and if you can't show exactly where the country of smelt and pour was for that steel, it will default to 200%. If it came from the UK, the UK steel tariff is 25%. That remains in place despite the 10% tariff. And they're talking about duty drawback here. That usually doesn't affect universities. It's for people who bring in products from a foreign country, incorporate them into other items, and then re-export those products. You won't be able to recover that steel and aluminum tariff when you re-export those products. Okay, I think a bigger deal probably for the university campuses is the end of what they're of de minimis. And this was effective August 29th. It's a long time exception for the US trade rules that has allowed goods valued under $800 to enter without paying duty or tax with an expedited clearance. So you don't need it. You don't have that customs clearance process. You don't have to pay any duty or tax for goods valued under $800. And that's no longer the case. Regardless of value, all shipments require a clearance process and require a duty and tariffs to be paid. And that's effective August 29th. So again, all your low value shipments that may have come in by US mail or FedEx or UPS, now those things are going to start requiring customs clearance. I've already started requiring a customs clearance. When this first happened, I understand that some of the foreign countries, because of all the confusion with this and the process required, they just stopped sending postal shipments to the US. They would send regular mail, but not packages. Just because, they weren't really sure how the process would work out. Most countries have reinstated that service, but you might still be unable to receive items from foreign countries that used to think where people used to mail them. They'll have to use the UPS or FedEx or something like that. So there are some possible exceptions to tariffs that many of them apply to universities. There is a list of HCS codes called Annex 2, which is actually exempted from those country-based tariffs. And so when something comes in, we look at that list, and if you are importing one of those products on that list, it's exempt from the tariffs. Another thing that comes up quite a bit with universities is returning research equipment. You take your research equipments. It may or may not have been made in the US, but you're taking your research equipment to a foreign country on a temporary basis, and then you're bringing it back within a year. We do need documentation to show customs. They ask for a certification by the foreign shipper, and they ask for a certification by the owner of the goods, stating that the goods were not advanced in value while they were overseas, and that they're coming back in the same condition. So we do need extra documentation for that process. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult when you're bringing back your own equipment because you're both the foreign shipper and the US owner of the goods. It helps if you can have another party sign some document that says the certification by the foreign seller that the goods have not been advanced in value. And that's their main concern. Anything that has been, where the value has been increased when it comes back is that increase in value is subject to duty. Which brings me to the next point, things that are returning after repair. So say you bought something from Germany, you have a problem with it, you have to send it back for repair. when it comes back into the country, you have to pay the duty and the tariff on the value of the repairs. Even if you didn't pay for those repairs, the custom says that if something has been repaired, it's been changed in condition, there was a value to that repair. So even if you didn't pay, you have to get some documentation to saying what the value of those repairs is, and you're subject to paying duty on those repairs. Things that are U.S. origin, it's a little easier to return them if they were made in the U.S. Anything that was made in the U.S. and exported like within the last 3 years can come back without paying any duty or tax. And there are some exemptions for temporary imports. I get a lot of questions about carnets. You can't get a carnet as a U.S. importer for shipment coming in, but you can ask the foreign party to get a carnet. So perhaps a collaborator is coming in, bringing some equipment, is going to be staying less than a year, and you don't want to be paying duty and tax on that. You ask them to get a carnet, and they can bring the carnet in for a year. They can bring the goods under the carnet for a year, but that time period cannot be extended. So if something might take a little bit longer than a year, you don't want to necessarily ask the foreign party to get a carnet. If the goods aren't re-exported within a year, it's actually the foreign party, that the carnet holder, that will be penalized and asked to pay the duty and tax if they can't show that the goods are re-exported. Another alternative is a temporary import bond, but this can be risky because double the duty will apply if proof of re-export or destruction is not provided to customs. So you have 1 year with a temporary import bond. You can request an extension to 2 years and then possibly even a 3rd year. After that, if you can't show that it was either re-exported or destroyed under customs supervision, you're going to be paying double the duty that would have otherwise applied. So there's some risk to that, but if you need a little bit longer than a year and you don't want to ask your foreign party to get a carnet, that's an option. Another option is the Florence Agreement. And what the Florence Agreement does is it allows items of educational or cultural value to be imported duty-free. This slide here, you'll have the slide deck available. It has a link that takes you to the application form. Usually, if you have something that's clearly of educational or cultural value, like artwork or books, perhaps movies, video materials, those things can be imported duty-free when they come in. However, if you're bringing in something like a scientific instrument, if you can show that you could not have obtained equivalent equipment of equivalent scientific value domestically, you can apply as the university for duty-free entry. The application process is pretty long. It actually requires you send an application to customs in 5 copies in original. You can't do it electronically. It has to be mailed. And they take customs looks at it. They submit it to the Department of the Treasury. They actually file a notice in the Federal Register to give domestic vendors a chance to come up with the equipment that you need. So it's not a quick process. It's not something you can just declare when something arrives, and it's limited to a certain list of commodities. Mostly, things that you'd normally use in science, microscope, telescope, something like that. But you can apply for duty-free entry. Right now, I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of these applications coming in. So the application process has never been quick. It's been like a 9-month process. And now with a whole bunch of applications coming in and also the government shutdown, I think the process is likely to start taking even longer. So you can apply for this for something you've purchased or about to purchase, uh, but given the timeline, you may have to pay the duty and wait on a refund if your application is approved. It's a kind of a lengthy process. And this is slide from also from a UCOP slide presentation gives you an idea of what the application might look like. It's there's a lot of paperwork involved because you do have to supply documentation and describe the process that you went through to determine that the item could not be obtained domestically. Okay, a little bit about when to call us. If you need help with customs clearance for a shipment that's already in transit, maybe you've been called by a carrier like FedEx or a forwarder, and they said, oh, and they'll tell you, okay, you have to sign our power of attorney so we can clear customs for you. Well, you can't sign their power of attorney. This has to be signed by a corporate officer, and because the customs bond is held by the regents, it has to be signed by the regents of the University of California, not even at the campus level. So this is something you can't do. Um, and so if somebody asks you to sign their power of attorney, you tell them you can't do it, and then you provide the information for your customs broker. So you can call us, you can give them our contact information, and we can do the customs clearance, and then that carrier can deliver. It, if you need a quote for transportation, maybe you've purchased something internationally and the terms of the sale are that you have to arrange the transportation. We can do that, and we can do that really worldwide, whether it needs to be by air freight or sea freight or even a domestic purchase. We can arrange transportation. If you're planning a high value purchase and you need an idea of what kind of duties and tariffs to expect, um, again, things are a little bit unpredictable lately, but we can certainly take a look at the commodity and give you an idea of what kind of tariffs you should expect, what you need to plan for. You should always let us know if you're buying something that is being transported by ocean, even if the seller is arranging the transport, because an importer security filing is required to be done 24 hours before the shipment is loaded on the vessel that it's going to arrive on. So we need to have a little bit of notice. And if it's a shipment that we're arranging the transport for, we'll have the information. Otherwise, you'll have to get that information from the seller or the transporter, uh, so that we'll have enough information to do that filing. Okay, so again, you're asked to sign a power of attorney, or sometimes they will ask for a customs form 5106. Um, so they'll send you this form and ask you to fill it out. And a lot of people ask us to fill that form out, but it requires a lot of information that we don't actually have, like documentation proving what your EIN number is, showing when you got the EIN number from the Department of the Treasury. So we can't fill out that form. We don't have the information any more than you do. So if somebody asks you to fill out form 5106, you just refer them to us and we'll handle the customs clearance. A lot of carriers will ask you to fill out a form. They have different names for the form. Like FedEx will say, ask you to fill out what they call a BSO form, a broker select option. And that's something you have to fill out because it's basically instructions to the carrier. They won't take instructions from us. They want instruction from the person receiving the shipment. And so if FedEx is unable to clear a shipment for you, you can just direct them to us. They'll ask you to fill out a form, and different carriers have different processes for that. You might have to fill out a form for UPS. I know that DHL will sometimes charge your account, I think $55 for turning over documents to us for the clearance. Um, If they can't find your account, they'll charge our account and we'll have to pass that cost along. But we can't proceed with clearance until we have the information and the documents and the carrier releases the shipment to us. But if we know something is coming, if you've given somebody a form and asked them to turn over a shipment to us, just let us know so that we can be expecting that and take a look at whatever documentation you have available in the meantime. What to do if you receive an arrival notice from us? Sometimes a carrier contacts us directly. They'll see in a purchase order that we're your customs broker, and they will just set it up with the carrier to automatically notify us when a shipment arrives. Something that we didn't know was coming. So when we get something like this, we figure out who the shipment is being sent to, and we reach out to that person. Because we need authorization before we can proceed with customs clearance. Usually at this point, we don't have enough information to know how much duty and tax will be payable. Sometimes it takes a few minutes, a few hours to figure that out. But we'll give you a list of possible charges, and we want to make sure that we don't clear something that we shouldn't be clearing. And of course, we want to make sure that you're going to be willing to accept our invoice for duty and tax when we send it. So before we proceed with anything, we really need to get your confirmation. We've also seen, shipments that were where a fraudulent purchase order was created. It doesn't actually belong to your university, and somebody's basically trying to steal from you. So, or steal from the seller. And so we want to make sure that any shipment we clear is one that we should be clearing. But what we do need from you is to respond as soon as possible. We'll try sending an email. We may make a phone call. And sometimes it's hard for us to tell exactly who a shipment should belong to. Just respond to us as soon as possible, and be aware that if we can't clear a shipment, carriers will start charging storage for a shipment, usually within a day or two after it arrives. And many carriers will send it back after 10 days if we can't get it cleared. So we do need a response as quickly as possible, and storage charges can be accumulating while we're waiting for that response. Okay, a little bit about our clearance process. When we're asked to clear a shipment, we make sure that somebody's going to accept that shipment and the clearance fees. And then we include you in an email conversation with our customs broker, because they're going to sometimes need to ask questions. They can look at the documents that are available and the description of the product, but sometimes they need to know, what is this going to be used for? Maybe they don't have a clear enough description to apply a harmonized tariff code, so they may have to ask some questions to figure out what the correct harmonized tariff code is. And sometimes we need additional documents. For example, if something, a laser, we need documents to state that that it complies with FDA regulations as far as emissions, and medical devices, anything that's covered by another government agency. We may need additional documents to get it through customs. And if we see something that's high value and it looks like it's likely to be a high duty clearance, we try to get an estimate for you, and sometimes we'll have the broker run a draft entry before they clear it, so that we have a clear idea of exactly how much duty you need to pay. Did I miss a slide? Okay, let's see. Okay, I guess I didn't. Okay, just a word about our transportation services. Whether it's an import or an export, we can arrange transportation. A lot of times you buy things from a foreign vendor and they don't include shipping. And that's actually good if for you to control the shipment yourself. If it's ocean freight, we know it's coming. We can make sure we'll have the information for the ISF filing and get it done. Um, and and whatever mode of transport is needed. Sometimes you buy something and you were planning to ship it by ocean freight, but then you end up needing it sooner. You can upgrade it to air freight, and you can work that out directly with us without having to get the vendor involved. And, a lot of times you might need an estimate of duty and tax to help with planning. So before you even make the purchase, you want to know, are you going to be paying a 10% tariff on this, or are you going to be paying 55% because it came from China and there's additional tariffs involved? And, in these days of extra high import costs, we're more often having to ask you for expedited payment of that duty and tax. Customs requires payment within 10 days. If the duty's under $1,000, we're going to send you a normal invoice, including a disbursement fee for the money that we're laying out to customs, and that can be processed normally. Up to $5,000, over $1,000, if it's up to $5,000, we're going to ask you to pay us right away. We can't really wait 30 days. So we will ask, for a credit card payment or something like that, P card. If duty is over $5,000, and we're seeing so many of these entries lately, we may have to ask for prepayment before we can transmit that customs entry. So, we've seen customs entries recently that they've had $250,000 worth of duty and tax, and that's a little more money than we're able to lay out on your behalf. So a lot of times we're going to have to ask, and this is happening more often recently, we're going to have to ask for prepayment before we transmit that entry to customs. So that's something you have to be prepared for. If it's a shipment we didn't know it was coming and it requires the outlay of a large portion of duty, sometimes it's just more than we're able to lay out for you. Okay.